My narcissistic mother hits on all of my boyfriends, as she thinks I don't deserve them. Still remember the exact moment I realized my mother would never let me be happy. And strangely enough, it wasn't during one of her screaming fits, or the passive-aggressive comments she loved to lace in every family dinner, but on a rainy Thursday evening when I sat alone in my apartment staring at the last message Tyler had sent me before blocking my number. "I care about you, Olivia, but this is too much. I can't keep doing this with your mother involved." Those words burned into me harder than any insult ever could, because deep down, I had known it was coming. My mother, Vanessa Carter, had always treated every man who came into my life as if he were part of some sick competition she had invented in her mind. A game in which she always needed to prove that she was more desirable, more charming, more unforgettable than her own daughter. For years I had tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that maybe I was being too sensitive, too protective, too unfair. But there comes a point when denial becomes impossible. It started when I was 16 and brought my first boyfriend, Noah, home for dinner. My mother had shown up in a dress so tight and glamorous that even I had been stunned, laughing as she said she had just thrown something on, then spent the entire meal leaning toward him, asking him questions in that low velvet voice she used whenever she wanted attention. By the end of the night, Noah had complimented her perfume twice and barely looked at me. Back then I told myself it was harmless. By 24, I knew better. Tyler had been different, or at least I thought so. He was kind, intelligent, and patient. A high school literature teacher with warm brown eyes and a calm steadiness that made me feel safe in ways I never had before. For the first few months, things had been perfect. Then my mother met him. Within a week she had found him on social media. Within 2 weeks she was sending him late-night messages disguised as jokes. Little things like "Olivia can be dramatic, can't she?" Followed by laughing emojis, or "I'm so glad she found someone mature enough to handle her moods." When Tyler finally showed me the messages, my stomach dropped. There were dozens of them, growing more personal, more inappropriate, more invasive. One night she texted him a photo of herself at a wine bar with the caption, "Wish you were here, at least someone in this family appreciates culture." I confronted her, shaking with rage, but she only smiled and said I was overreacting, that she was just being friendly. Tyler tried to brush it off at first, but I saw the discomfort growing in him. Then came the final blow. She invited him to lunch behind my back, under the pretense of discussing a birthday surprise for me. He went because he genuinely thought she wanted to do something nice. Instead, she spent the entire lunch telling him that I was emotionally unstable, that relationships overwhelmed me, that I tended to push people away. By the time he told me what happened, the damage was done. A week later, he ended things. I cried harder than I had in years, not just because I had lost him, but because I had lost another piece of myself to the woman who was supposed to protect me. For 3 days, I barely left my bed. On the 4th day, my phone rang, and the name lighting up the screen was Alex Morgan. Alex had been my closest friend since college, one of the few people who knew the full truth about my mother. He was an actor, brilliant, witty, effortlessly charming, and openly gay, which somehow made him the perfect person to understand the absurdity of my situation. The moment I heard his voice, something in me cracked open. I told him everything. Every text, every manipulation, every cruel detail. There was a long silence on the line before he said, "Olivia, she keeps doing this because no one has ever made her face what she is." I remember sitting up slowly in bed, wiping my tears. "What are you saying?" He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that meant he had already formed a dangerous idea. "I'm saying we give her exactly what she wants." At first I thought he was joking, but as he laid out the plan, I felt something awaken inside me. Not revenge exactly, but resolve. Alex would pretend to be my new boyfriend. We would let my mother do what she always did, flirt, manipulate, overstep, and reveal herself. Then we would expose everything. Part of me hesitated because it felt cruel, but another part of me was tired. Tired of being the daughter who always had to be the bigger person, the understanding one, the forgiving one. For once, I wanted the truth to stand in full light. A week later, I brought Alex to Sunday dinner at my mother's house. The moment she opened the door and saw him standing beside me in a fitted navy suit with a bouquet of white roses in his hand, her eyes widened in a way I instantly recognized. Interest. Calculation. Challenge. Mom, I said, forcing a calm smile. This is Alex. He stepped forward with perfect ease, taking her hand and kissing the air beside her cheek in a smooth, practiced gesture. Mrs. Carter, he said warmly, Olivia talks about you all the time. I almost laughed because that was technically true, just not in the way she imagined. My mother's smile sharpened. Only good things, I hope. Alex turned toward me with such believable affection that even I nearly forgot this was a performance. The best things, he said, placing a hand gently at the small of my back. My mother noticed that touch immediately. I saw it in the flicker of her eyes. Throughout dinner, Alex played his role flawlessly. He was attentive to me, asking about my work, remembering small details I had mentioned, making me laugh in a way that felt startlingly real. But he was also just charming enough with my mother to keep her engaged, complimenting the meal, praising the decor, asking about her travels. It was like watching a master performer on stage. By dessert, she was completely hooked. The texts started the very next morning. Alex showed them to me while we sat in a coffee shop, trying not to burst into disbelieving laughter. Lovely meeting you last night. The first one read, Olivia seems happy. I'm glad someone is finally giving her attention. By the third day, the messages had shifted. You seem too sophisticated for someone her age. Then, if you ever need a break from Olivia's drama, I'm always here for a mature conversation. Each message was another brick in the wall of proof I had spent years trying to build in my own mind. Yet seeing it written so plainly still hurt. This was my mother, my own mother. There were moments I almost called the whole thing off because despite everything, some childish part of me still longed for her love. But every time I doubted myself, Alex reminded me why we were doing this. You deserve peace, Liv, he said one evening as we reviewed another string of increasingly inappropriate messages. This isn't about humiliating her. It's about showing her that you see her clearly now. As the days passed, my mother's obsession deepened. She began calling me more often, pretending casual interest. So, how serious is this with Alex? She asked one afternoon, her tone deceptively light. Very, I answered. There was a pause. Do you really think he's the settling down type? I smiled bitterly to myself. There it was, the seed of doubt she always planted. But this time, I was ready. Yes, I said evenly. He makes me happy. Her voice cooled. Well, happiness can be deceptive. That night, Alex and I sat in my apartment, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to power. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I was no longer helpless. I was no longer the frightened girl watching her mother steal every safe place from her. This time, I was prepared. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the real confrontation was coming. This was only the beginning. By the second week of Alex playing the role of my boyfriend, the atmosphere around my life had shifted into something tense and electric, like the air before a thunderstorm, and I could feel the inevitable confrontation building with every passing day. My mother had always been subtle in the beginning, wrapping her manipulation in silk and perfume, disguising cruelty as concern, but once she sensed a challenge to her control, she became bolder, almost reckless. It started with the calls. At first they came once a day, usually in the afternoon, always with the same fake, casual tone. How are things with Alex? She would ask, stretching his name as if tasting it. Then the questions became more pointed. Does he ever talk about marriage? Do you really trust him? Men like that don't usually settle down so quickly. Every word was carefully designed to make me doubt myself, to reopen the wounds she had spent years creating. But this time, I wasn't the same woman who had sat crying over Tyler's last message. This time I was watching her, listening, collecting every crack in the mask she had worn for so long. Meanwhile, Alex was receiving messages from her that had grown from inappropriate to openly disturbing. He would come over in the evenings, toss his phone onto my couch, and let me read them. I hope Olivia appreciates how lucky she is, one read. Another said, some women don't know how to keep a man interested for long. Then came the one that made my blood run cold. Sometimes the wrong woman gets the right man. I stared at the screen in silence, my stomach twisting with a mix of fury and heartbreak. Even though this was exactly what we had expected, seeing it unfold so blatantly still felt surreal. She's escalating, Alex said quietly, leaning back in the armchair across from me. She's going to make a move soon. I knew he was right. My mother had never tolerated losing attention, and the more Alex appeared devoted to me, the more desperate she became to prove that she could take him if she wanted. 3 days later, the move came. I was at work, when my phone buzzed with her name flashing across the screen. The moment I answered, I knew something was different. Her voice was soft, almost trembling, with that carefully rehearsed vulnerability she used whenever she wanted sympathy. "Olivia," she said, "I need to talk to you about something important." My heart pounded. "What is it?" There was a long pause, and then she sighed dramatically. "I didn't want this to happen, but I think I'm developing feelings for Alex." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. My grip tightened around the phone so hard my fingers hurt. She continued before I could speak. "I know how terrible this sounds, but you have to understand, sometimes connections happen unexpectedly. He understands me in ways people rarely do." I felt something icy settle over me. It wasn't shock exactly, more the horrifying confirmation of everything I had always known. "Mom," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, "what exactly are you saying?" She exhaled as though burdened by some tragic confession. "I'm saying I think he feels it too. I can tell by the way he looks at me. Maybe he's only staying with you because he doesn't want to hurt you." There it was, the final line crossed. The same strategy she had used with every man before: create doubt, claim a special connection, position herself as the more desirable woman. But this time, she had walked directly into the trap. I ended the call with a calmness that even surprised me and immediately rang Alex. He answered on the first ring. "It happened, didn't it?" He said. "Worse," I replied. "She says she's falling in love with you." There was a beat of silence, and then he gave a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "Wow. Even for her, that's impressive." We agreed it was time. No more waiting, no more gathering evidence. The confrontation had to happen now. The following evening, I invited my mother to my apartment, under the pretense of having a serious conversation about Alex and our future. She arrived dressed in a cream silk blouse and red lipstick, looking far too glamorous for what was supposed to be a private mother-to-daughter discussion. The moment I opened the door, I saw it in her expression: confidence. She truly believed she had won. Alex was already inside, seated calmly on the sofa, one arm draped over the backrest, looking every bit the composed and polished man she had become obsessed with. My mother froze for a fraction of a second when she saw him, then recovered with a practiced smile. "Oh," she said lightly, "I didn't realize Alex would be joining us." "He needs to be here," I said, closing the door behind her. For the first few minutes the room was thick with false politeness. My mother perched elegantly on the chair opposite us, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. She looked between us with the expression of someone preparing to deliver difficult but noble news. Finally, she turned to me. "Olivia," she began softly, "I know this may hurt, but I think it's better to be honest. Alex and I have developed feelings for each other." Hearing her say it out loud made my chest tighten with a mix of anger and disbelief. Before I could respond, Alex leaned forward, his expression suddenly losing every trace of warmth. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and devastatingly direct. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I need to stop you right there." My mother blinked, clearly thrown off. "Excuse me?" Alex's eyes met hers, cool and unwavering. "There are no feelings, not from me. There never were." The color drained slightly from her face. I don't understand." He stood slowly, every movement deliberate, and for the first time since this began, I saw not the charming fake boyfriend but my fiercely loyal friend. "I'm gay," he said plainly. "I have been in a committed relationship with my partner Daniel for 6 years." Silence exploded in the room. My mother stared at him, her mouth slightly open, unable to process what she was hearing. Alex continued, each word landing like a hammer. "Olivia and I created this relationship because she needed proof. Proof of what you've been doing to her for years." My mother's head snapped toward me, her eyes filled not with guilt, but with outrage. "You tricked me?" she hissed. My voice shook, but I forced myself to speak. "No, Mom, you exposed yourself." For a moment she looked genuinely stunned, and then the mask shattered. The elegant composure vanished, replaced by the raw, furious narcissism I had spent my life tiptoeing around. "This is disgusting," she spat, rising to her feet. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" I laughed bitterly, the sound trembling in my throat. "Everything you've done for me? You ruined every relationship I ever had because you couldn't stand not being the center of attention." Her face twisted. "Don't be dramatic, Olivia. Men leave because you're insecure and clingy." The old words, the ones she had used to cut me down for years, might once have destroyed me. But standing there beside Alex, seeing the truth finally laid bare, they no longer had power. Alex stepped closer, his voice cold. "Do you realize how abnormal it is to compete with your own daughter for male attention?" That question hit harder than anything else. For the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not remorse, but the recognition that someone had finally named what she was. Her hands trembled with rage. "You have no right to judge me," she snapped. "You manipulated me." "No," I said, meeting her gaze. "We gave you an opportunity to behave like a mother, and you chose this." Her breathing became sharp and uneven. Then, in one sudden violent motion, she grabbed the half-full wine glass from the coffee table and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, red wine splattering down the pale paint like blood. I flinched, but Alex instinctively stepped in front of me. My mother pointed a shaking finger at both of us. "You're both cruel, pathetic little liars," she shouted. "Don't ever speak to me again." Then she stormed out, slamming the door so hard the framed picture in my hallway rattled. The apartment fell into a heavy silence, broken only by my own uneven breathing. For several seconds I just stood there, staring at the wine dripping down the wall, my heart pounding so violently I could hear it in my ears. Then, unexpectedly, I began to cry. Not the broken, helpless crying of heartbreak, but something deeper and stranger. A release. Years of pain, confusion, self-doubt, and quiet humiliation poured out of me all at once. Alex wrapped his arms around me and held me while I cried against his shoulder. "It's over," he murmured softly. "She can't hide from it anymore." But even as relief washed over me, I knew my mother wouldn't let the story end there. Women like her never accepted accountability. She would rewrite the narrative, twist the truth, and cast herself as the victim. And somehow I already knew the next battle would not be with her alone, but with the family she would try to turn against me. The silence that followed my mother's dramatic exit lasted less than 12 hours, because by the next morning the damage campaign had already begun. And in a way, it was almost impressive how quickly Vanessa Carter could transform herself from aggressor to victim. I woke up to 17 missed calls, 9 unread texts, and 3 voicemails, all from different family members. And the moment I saw my Aunt Melissa's name flash again across the screen, I knew exactly what had happened. My mother had spent the entire night rewriting the story. According to the version she had clearly fed everyone, I had orchestrated a cruel and humiliating prank against her, invited a man into her life under false pretenses, and emotionally attacked her in my apartment for no reason other than resentment and jealousy. There was no mention of the years of sabotage, the late-night messages to my boyfriends, the lunches behind my back, the whispered poison she had poured into every relationship I had ever tried to build. In her version, she was a loving mother who had simply been trying to help her daughter make better choices, and I had repaid her with betrayal. When I finally listened to Aunt Melissa's voicemail, her voice was sharp with disappointment. "Olivia, I don't know what's gotten into you, but humiliating your own mother like this is beyond cruel. Call me." I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, and for the first time since the confrontation, the old exhaustion settled back into my bones. This was what my mother had always done best. She never just hurt you directly, she made sure the entire world saw you as the villain too. But this time, something inside me had changed. Instead of breaking down, I opened my messages with a strange calmness. Alex had saved everything, every inappropriate text, every suggestive comment, every manipulative late-night message she had sent him. There it was, in black and white, undeniable and ugly. I spent the next hour forwarding screenshots to every family member who had contacted me, without explanation, without defense, without emotion, just the truth. Then I turned my phone face down and made coffee. By noon, the tone of the messages had changed. My cousin Rachel texted first. "Oh my God, Olivia, I had no idea." Then Aunt Melissa, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have assumed." My Uncle Daniel didn't even try to apologize. He simply sent, "Your mother needs help." But the most telling response was the one I never got. My mother said nothing. No angry texts, no screaming voicemail, no attempt to defend herself. She had realized the story had slipped out of her control, and for someone like her, that silence said everything. For the next few weeks, she disappeared completely. No calls, no surprise visits, no passive-aggressive messages. At first it felt unnatural, almost eerie, like living in a house after the storm had passed, but before you trusted the sky again. I kept expecting her to reappear, to strike back somehow. But instead, there was only distance. And in that distance, I started to notice something I hadn't felt in years: peace. My apartment felt lighter. My mind felt clearer. I stopped checking my phone with dread every morning. I went to work without carrying that constant knot of anxiety in my chest. It was as if I had spent my whole life living in a room filled with noise, and had only now stepped into silence. Alex remained my anchor through all of it. One evening, as we sat on my balcony with takeout containers balanced on our laps, he looked at me with that familiar mix of warmth and blunt honesty. "Now comes the hard part," he said. I frowned. I thought the hard part was exposing her. He shook his head gently. "No. The hard part is not letting her back in the same way." Those words stayed with me because he was right. My mother's absence wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of learning how to live with boundaries. For the first time in my life, I stopped answering every family call immediately. I stopped explaining myself to people who demanded emotional access simply because they shared my blood. I stopped feeling guilty for protecting my peace. And somewhere in the middle of that healing, life did something unexpected. It gave me love again. I met James Whitmore on a rainy Tuesday in late autumn at a charity fundraiser hosted by my firm. He was a lawyer, sharp, composed, and quietly confident, the kind of man who never needed to dominate a room to own it. He had dark hair, calm gray eyes, and a way of listening that made you feel like the rest of the world had faded into the background. We started talking near the coffee table after I accidentally bumped into him and nearly spilled espresso down the front of his suit. Instead of irritation, he smiled and said, "Well, this is one way to make an impression." I laughed harder than the joke deserved, mostly because it had been so long since anyone made being around them feel effortless. Over the next few months, James became a steady presence in my life. There was no chaos, no manipulation, no emotional games. He was kind without being performative, protective without being controlling, and perhaps most importantly, he saw people clearly. When I finally told him about my mother, really told him everything, he listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, bracing myself for pity or judgment, he simply said, "None of that was normal, Olivia, and none of it was your fault. But it's your responsibility now to never let it happen again." It was exactly what I needed to hear. The real test came 3 months later, when my mother resurfaced. It was Christmas Eve, and against every instinct in my body, I agreed to attend a family dinner because my grandmother begged me to come. James insisted on coming with me, and I was grateful for the quiet strength of his presence. The moment we entered my grandmother's dining room, my mother's eyes landed on him. I saw the familiar spark there, the quick assessment, the reflexive instinct to charm. But something was different this time. James extended his hand politely, introduced himself, and then immediately returned his attention to me, pulling out my chair before taking his own seat beside me. Throughout the entire evening, my mother tried every version of her old tactics. She complimented his watch, laughed a little too warmly at his jokes, even asked pointed questions about his career and schedule. But James met every attempt with cool professionalism, and then redirected his focus back to me. At one point she said with a smile, "Olivia can be difficult when she's stressed." James didn't even blink. He simply replied, "I haven't found that to be true. She's one of the strongest people I know." The look on my mother's face was almost worth every year of pain that had come before. For the first time, her usual methods found no opening. James saw straight through the performance, and more than that, he made it clear without ever causing a scene that I came first. A year later, he proposed to me on the steps of the old city library, where we had gone on our second date. It was winter, snow clinging to the stone railings, and when he knelt down with that small velvet box in his hand, I cried before he even asked the question. "Olivia Carter," he said softly, "will you marry me?" I laughed through tears and said yes, before he could finish the sentence. Planning the wedding brought with it a new set of anxieties, the biggest one wearing designer heels and answering to Mother. I considered not inviting her at all, but after months of careful thought and many long conversations with James, I chose a middle ground. She would be invited, but the boundaries would be absolute. No involvement in planning, no private conversations, no emotional access. On the day of the wedding, I was terrified she would create a scene, but to my surprise, she behaved almost perfectly. She wore an elegant pale silver dress, smiled for photographs, and kept her comments limited to socially acceptable pleasantries. Still, the narcissism found its small ways to shine through. During the bouquet toss, she positioned herself front and center, caught it with a dramatic laugh, and loudly announced, "Looks like I'm next." The room erupted in awkward laughter, and for a split second I felt the old irritation rise. But then I looked at James waiting for me on the dance floor, smiling with that steady warmth I had come to trust, and I let it go, because that was the truth I had finally learned. My mother was never going to become the mother I had once wished for. There would be no magical transformation, no heartfelt apology, no sudden awakening into self-awareness. Some people remain exactly who they are. The healing does not come from changing them. It comes from changing your access to them. As I stood in my wedding dress, my hand in James's, surrounded by people who genuinely loved me, I understood something that took me years to learn. You cannot fix a narcissistic parent. You cannot love them into becoming safe. All you can do is protect yourself, set boundaries, and choose a life where their chaos no longer defines your peace. And for the first time in my life, I was no longer the frightened daughter trying to win a love that was always conditional. I was simply Olivia, stronger, clearer, and finally free.